Gestoso, on today's show, the possible trade war between the U.S., Mexico, Brazil, and other trade partners of United States, and the possible summit between President Trump and Korean leader Kim Jong Un, with the political analyst Emilio Viano. Emilio Viano, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Emilio, do you think that the trade war is going to intensify?
Well, all the signals are that it will, particularly with Canada and the European Union. It will be a little more difficult for Mexico to resist because what is in play for them is much more substantial. But at least with Canada and the European Union, I wouldn't be surprised. The European Union has already presented a complaint in front of the World Trade Organization, and they are already readying sanctions against the U.S. that might take effect in the middle of June. So they were ready and they want to respond forcefully. And this is what maybe Washington didn't expect, because as we know, some countries like China, Brazil, Argentina decided to give in and either limit their exports or pay the penalties in order to keep everything as is, to their disfavor, of course. And there is some surprise, I think, in Washington, particularly the Secretary of Commerce, Ross, has kind of mentioned that you know, the others are paying and they are also negotiating. Why can't the European pay and also negotiate? In other words, they think that they can, in a certain way, impose their will and threaten the other side, that is then continuing to implore them to please, you know, reach an agreement.
Some of the reactions. We're talking the European Commission saying U.S. is playing a dangerous game. Mexico, that is the third partner of the U.S., he said it rejects unilateral protectionist measures. And also they're going to retaliate, they say, penalizing pork, apples, grapes, cheeses, and flat steel. As you mentioned, the European Commission president, when talking about Jean-Claude Juncker, he said this is protectionism pure and simple. French President Macron, this is illegal. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called it totally unacceptable. So the reaction is pretty strong worldwide.
Absolutely, and I think that we have to remember that protectionism and trade wars were very much at the root of the last two world wars. So in a way, commerce can play a real role in starting conflict in the world. So it is not just a commercial issue or a symbolic issue. It can also have an impact on peace, what is happening in the world. And it is extremely dangerous. First of all, because I think that what is happening is that Trump is transferring, as in many other things, his way of doing business. And we know that he was not very well respected by everybody. He had quite a bad reputation, actually, for not even paying his contractors and often imposing his will with threats and indeed with penalties. And I think that he thinks that he can do this with countries. And it's not going to work. First, because there is national pride, obviously. But secondly, there are real interests. There is real loss of export and of revenues. And it also disrupts the markets to a great extent. There are many repercussions, and in the end, it may backfire, because the U.S. will also pay a price, and it will immediately. Of course, the Secretary of Commerce, Ross, dismisses it, says, oh, well, the price of a car will increase at the most 1%. That is his idea. We don't know what is going to happen. So the Americans are in for it too, because if we impose a 25% tariff on
the
steel or on aluminum, a little less, prices will go up in this country. There is no question about it. One problem that this also creates is this, that as the U.S. closes its borders, let's say to aluminum and to steel, where does this aluminum and steel go that is not being sent to the U.S.? It is already arriving in Europe. The arrival of aluminum and steel in Europe has already increased almost 9% since the beginning of the year, mostly from China. And obviously the Europeans now are also facing their own problems with their own commercial treaties that allow the importation of metals, because the countries that cannot sell it to the US now say, where are we going to send it? Send it to Europe. And so the Europeans are not only threatened by the tariff, but also threatened by a flood of products that cannot reach the US anymore. That's why in the past this would lead even to armed conflict.
The reputation, if you want, of the Republicans, the political party of Donald Trump, is preaching free trade. Overall, free flow of merchandises, of capitals throughout the world. This is going absolutely against the principle of his party.
But of course, and that is the irony of this all, that the very party that often said we should open commerce freely and trade and let the market decide many different things, is now very silent, or up to now very silent with what Trump is doing. And Trump, we all know, is not a real Republican, he is Trump. And he acts as he sees in his own interest. And it cannot be excluded that obviously this closing of the borders and bringing back industry is not necessarily always a benevolent measure, to bring back important industries and to create jobs. It may be also to benefit himself and his cronies that say, let's produce it here. Once we produce it here, it is almost a monopoly because we rejected imports, and now people have to pay, and we make billions. We earn much more than we are now. So I'm not sure that it is such a benign intention as he presents it, to make America great again.
Because he mentioned it that he was, in March, he said, we are doing it in the national security interest. That's what he was trying to present it.
Obviously, this is being disputed, particularly by Canada, who says, where is the national interest, particularly with an ally as reliable as Canada? Sure, you can argue that if you import many strategic materials, you are a little bit dependent on foreign powers should a problem arise in the future. But let's say with Canada, we never had any problems. There is none foreseeable. There have been tremendous allies of the U.S. in all the world wars and all the other conflicts. So this is just an excuse. And it is also not really for the security of the U.S., because once you monopolize a product, like let's say it's produced only in the US or in majority in the US, you are also then depending on the private sector, and the private sector can then impose, let's say, very high prices, which can have tremendous repercussion on the economy. Plus, they also have at times to depend on foreign sources of the raw materials from which they produce metals and aluminum. And so it is really very hard today to imagine that anyone would close borders and go back to the 19th century declaring coal beautiful and clean. And the same
as he did.
And the same with diesel, as he did recently, also clean. He talks about clean diesel, clean coal. This is impossible. And we all know that the other parts of the world, particularly China, are rapidly moving towards
clean energy.
Clean energy, produced mostly with solar energy and the wind and other sources, and they are vastly outpacing the United States. So in a way, Trump is saying, let's go back to the 19th century, while the other countries, particularly China, that is the ascendant power, is moving towards the 22nd century. And we will have to pay a very high price for this.
We're talking about the political repercussions, for example. And we talked that there are two Republican leaders in the Congress. In the Senate, we're talking about Mitch McConnell. In the House of Representatives, we're talking about Paul Ryan. And the European Union has already said, we are going to target tariffs on the states that those two leaders are from in order for them to feel the pain. Is that going to have some impact in, for example, in the midterm elections of November?
But of course, and that is what they should be very nervous about. Up to now, the products that have been identified by Canada, the European Union, Mexico, are not yet really biting very badly. They're mostly symbolic, marmalade, you know, this type of products, herbicides, things that are not that central. But when it would come, let's say, to soybeans, to rice, to sugar, to agricultural products in general, that would definitely undermine the political base not only of the Republicans but of Trump, because he won mostly because of the support of the agricultural states, let's say Iowa, for example, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma. In other words, there is very powerful. And if these people see that they cannot sell, or if they want to sell, they have to sell at a very low price, they are not going to be happy. And they are, of course, I'm sure, already quite nervous. And it is for this reason, as we know, that Trump is going much more prudently with China. And we saw it in the recent very strange back and forth over XTE, an important electronics firm in China that has been found to sell technology to Iran, North Korea, and also to possibly sell in this country electronics that actually spy on the United States. And sanctions were imposed on this firm, and they were so dramatic, the Americans being the biggest market that they have, to almost put them in bankruptcy. And all of a sudden, after we announced these sanctions, Trump intervenes supposedly to save jobs in China.
In China, exactly,
which is,
yeah.
You know, absolutely
the irony.
Against all his speech in saying we want to create more jobs in the U.S. and bring them back from China. So there is a suspicion there that personal gain was involved, in the sense that in Indonesia, they are building a very big amusement park, and Trump will have properties there and strong financial interests, but they didn't have enough capital. And China, all of a sudden, interestingly, made it possible to receive $500 million investment from China to proceed. Plus, we know that the daughter of the president, Ivanka Trump, has received 13 trademarks from China in recent times. So we see there indeed the specter of corruption and self-interest. In other words, in a way, you could say honestly that this is a government of plutocrats that gain power, deluding the lower classes that they are going to be their friends and protect their interests. And now that they are in the government, they do what they do best. Let's make it legal for us to steal as much as we can. And that is often what happens, that people in power say, hey, now that we can, let's change the laws so that they are favorable to us. And whatever happens, well, they will have to pay the price, the future administration, the future governments. And that is what they've been doing, particularly with this famous tax reform that, as we know, is totally in favor of the big corporations that are earning billions more than they used to, including Trump himself, and transmitting very little tax cuts to the middle class or lower class that also expire in 7 years, while the others are permanent. So we can see there immediately the situation. And we saw it, for example, with Harley Davidson the other day, where they decided, having received millions in tax cuts, to close their factory in Missouri with the loss of over 800 jobs and move it to Thailand. So exactly the contrary. And some people may remember when at the beginning of his presidency, Trump had kind of a mini fair of important American products at the White House, on the lawn in front of the White House. And Harley Davidson was there with the motorcycles. And now Harley Davidson is saying, bye-bye, we are going to Thailand, exactly the opposite of what Trump did promise.
In the case of the American public, most of his political base, do you think in the way that he presented, because President Trump says we are saving jobs, we are protecting, quote unquote, the American industries, so therefore I'm looking like I'm a sort of savior of the interests of the people and the industries of the country. Are they going to buy this if they start to realize that it's going to hurt their pockets because things are going to increase our prices, and therefore, rather than benefit from that quote-unquote philosophy, they're going to feel the pain that is, as you mentioned, in reality, the opposite effect?
Well, up to now, I think not yet. They are still trying to believe that Trump is there for them. And with the news like today that the unemployment is now 3.8%, the lowest in
many years,
in many years, people feel reassured. Because in the end, people want to put food on the table, pay their mortgage, and buy shoes for their children. So they say, I'm okay, more or less. But there too, people should ask themselves, they talk about creating all these jobs, but are they good jobs or not? What type of jobs are they? Do they pay well? Of course not. The majority of the jobs created, announced today, are in retail. And the others is on medical services like nurses, people attending elderly people, and so on and so forth. They are not high-paying job, unfortunately, particularly the retail. We all know that it's not a high-paying career. And so people should ask themselves that too. But in the end, if these sanctions and trade war takes place, there will be a very high price to pay. And we already see it in gas, in the gasoline prices and diesel prices. After Trump threatened Iran and pulled out of the agreement that we have with Iran, the gasoline prices began to surge. And now they are, by and large, over $3, $3.50 a gallon, which has not been that way for quite some time. And it is not just what we buy at the pump to take a trip. Transport is for everything, for the groceries that arrive to the supermarket, for the furniture that arrive at the store, for the cars that come to the dealer. They all have to be transported, and most often diesel is used. So prices are slowly but certainly growing. Eventually, people will feel the bite, particularly, I think, if the sanctions by European Union and other countries will be very well focused on what it hurts the most, which is agriculture.
And in the case of Mexico, there are two issues here. We're talking about the tariffs that Mexico say they're going to retaliate, as I was mentioning before, and also the renegotiation of the free trade agreement, TLC in Spanish. What's your gut feeling that is going to end up happening?
Well, certainly it is not a good move on the part of the U.S. towards friends and neighbors that while you are negotiating a new version of a free trade treaty, you impose sanctions. You impose, duties on what they are exporting, fully legally, according to the treaty, still in force to your country. So it is kind of a contradictory message. It's like saying, negotiate with me, but I'm putting a gun to your temple. And, if you don't say yes, something bad might happen to you. And that is really where it is creating this lack of trust. And obviously, certainly for politicians in their own countries, Canada, Mexico, also they need to take a strong stand and resist. And particularly if in Mexico, Obrador is going to win the election, the next election that is coming very soon.
Yeah, July 1st.
Exactly. The music may change dramatically. For now, actually, the sanctions are not that biting for Mexico because they impact only Michoacán, Coahuila. There's not, an enormous, effect on the entire country. But if they continue, they will threaten. And I remember going recently to Guanajuato, where they are very proud of all the automotive industry that they have. And all of this would mean, basically, it has been calculated 100,000 millions of dollars. So you're talking about an enormous sum of money for Mexico. It would create also problems for us, because that's the irony of this, that because of the TLC, of this NAFTA treaty, cars are produced both in the US and Mexico. 40% of the content of cars coming into the US from Mexico have American components. So if we close the door, we are also closing the door on ourselves. It is not that they are totally produced in Mexico. It is already a shared task, which, as it should be, if you have free commerce and free trade. So this is also why it is difficult to understand how anyone who knows a little bit about commerce would slap these tariffs and threaten to close the border, because if 40% of the content of a car is made here, and these cars go back and forth in a way between Mexico and the US where they are being produced, people on this side of the fence also, the US, will lose their jobs. And there is already the prediction that, particularly in the automotive area, thousands of Americans, we are talking about hundreds of thousands, will lose their jobs. So if this happens, obviously there will be a very negative reaction to Trump. And actually, he might be writing his obituary as a politician if this really comes to pass. I think that it's possible that he, as he used to do as a businessman, bluffs and threatens and wants to see if the other, is afraid and say, yes, sure, of course. Like, in a way, Brazil, Argentina, in part China have done up to now. But there are other countries that don't agree as easily, like the European Union and also, of course, Canada and Mexico. And there is where it could backfire badly on Trump.
Let's go very quickly to the North Korea U.S. possible summit. What is what you are following with more attention that might happen or not?
Well, I think that this is mostly symbolic, and it is for the gain of both. It will be a wonderful photo opportunity for the president and for Kim Jong Un, that there is a Korean emissary received in Washington, received in the White House. For them, it's a super victory. Imagine, Kim Jong Un has been in China, has been invited to Moscow, he's been to South Korea, his emissary was in New York, he walks into the White House. For him, all of this is a fantastic triumph for a country that was totally isolated, shunned, and not very much liked worldwide. So both of them are gaining. Trump, of course, because he says, see, here I am bringing peace. Where is my Nobel Prize? I'm expecting it. And from Kim Jong Un saying, see, I'm important. I'm now accepted. People take me seriously. The President of the United States is going to travel to Singapore to meet with me. For him, it's a fantastic victory to maintain the meeting, even though I think that it will not result in anything substantial, because the definition of eliminating the nuclear factor in North Korea is understood very differently.
Even inside the White House, there are differences. For example, divisions. We're talking about John Bolton being pretty skeptical of positive results. In the case of the Secretary of State Pompeo and the Secretary of Defense John Mattis, they are pro-summit. So not necessarily all the team are in the same page.
Yeah. But basically what is happening is that, as we know, with the change in the guard, particularly Tillerson's departure, for example, the previous Minister of Foreign Affairs, now we have, Hawks in control as advisors to the president. So we go back. Remember, Bolton was the architect of the war in Iraq. And so this man likes to bomb and to go to war, even though it is a disaster at the end. And certainly he likes to do that. And that is the problem and the danger for the U.S. too, that this will lead us maybe some move that might threaten hostilities. And it might not be easy to hold the line. Hopefully, particularly with the coming together, apparently quite warm, between South and North Korea, this may not take place. But we are really in danger, and even more so, I think, with Iran. Why? Because North Korea has powerful protectors, most of all China, and even Russia that shares a little bit of a frontier with them. Iran has no protector. And so it is the weaker country that they can focus on if they have to save face and start bombing. North Korea, I think they will be much more careful as they have been up to date, because China is the great protector, and China certainly doesn't want peace that brings 30,000 American troops to its border.
Emilio Viano, thanks very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.